Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something the church definitely didn't want you to know about. The forbidden love stories of medieval times. The ones that made nuns forget they were married to Jesus. Made monks discover that 16 years of celibacy was no match for a widow with a brain. Made Jewish physicians and Christian nobles prove that love doesn't care what God you pray to. Because it turns out, people in the Middle Ages weren't just dying of plague and eating gruel, they were making terrible, beautiful, catastrophically stupid decisions in the name of romance. So before we dive into these tales of terrible romantic decisions, hit that like button and subscribe if this is your kind of history. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, close your eyes, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Love in the Middle Ages was basically illegal. Not literally, though honestly it might as well have been. See, medieval society had more rules about who could touch whom than a modern HR department. Except instead of sensitivity training, breaking the rules got you excommunicated, castrated, or if you were really unlucky, both. Just ask Abelard. Actually don't, he's still bitter about it 900 years later. The church controlled marriage like a medieval franchise operation. Nobles married for land deals, peasants married for survival. Monks and nuns married Jesus, which sounds romantic until you realise Jesus never helps with the laundry and definitely doesn't keep you warm during those freezing monastery nights. Jews and Christians weren't supposed to acknowledge each other as human, let alone fall in love, and everyone, absolutely everyone, was watching everyone else for signs of inappropriate feelings. It was like living in a small town where the gossip could literally kill you. But here's the thing about humans. Tell them they can't have something, and suddenly that's all they want. Put a bunch of young people in castles and convents, tell them they absolutely cannot fall in love with each other, and watch what happens. It's like the medieval version of trying not to think about elephants. Suddenly, elephants everywhere. Except the elephants could get you walled up in a convent, or branded as a thief for the crime of existing near the wrong person. So tonight, we're going to explore what happened when medieval people decided that maybe, just maybe, love was worth risking everything for. From the Tuscan nun who fell for a wounded knight to the crusader who discovered Muslim princesses were more interesting than holy wars. From the famous tragedy of Abelard and Heloise to nobles who gave up everything just to be with someone who actually liked them for themselves. Because in a world where your marriage was a business transaction and your body was property, choosing love wasn't just romantic, it was revolutionary, and occasionally spectacularly stupid. But always, always human. Let's start with the classic combination: holy vows versus unholy desires. What happens when someone married to God meets someone who makes them reconsider the terms of that marriage? Let's start with the classic. The nun who forgot she was married to Jesus. Her name was Sister Benedetta, and in 1312 she was living in a convent in Tuscany, spending her days in prayer, contemplation, and slowly losing her mind from boredom. Because here's what they don't tell you about medieval convent life. It's essentially prison with better singing. You wake up at 2 a.m. for prayers, then more prayers at dawn, then breakfast, which is prayers with bread. Then guess what? More prayers. The schedule went something like this. Matins at 2 a.m, where you stumbled through psalms while trying not to fall asleep standing up. Lauds at dawn, assuming you could tell when dawn was through windows designed to keep out both light and hope. Prime at 6, terce at 9, sext at noon, because someone had a sense of humour about naming prayer times. None at 3, vespers at sunset, compline before bed. 8 times a day, every day, forever. It was like having an alarm that only played one song, and the song was about how unworthy you were. Sister Benedetta was 23, which in medieval nun years is basically middle-aged. She'd been in the convent since she was 14, when her parents decided that having too many daughters was expensive, and God probably needed another wife. Her dowry to Christ was smaller than what her sisters got for earthly husbands, which tells you everything about medieval priorities. Earthly husbands needed land and gold. Jesus, apparently, would settle for some candles and a promise of eternal virginity. She was beautiful, which was unfortunate in a place where beauty was considered a spiritual liability. The kind of beauty that made other nuns suggest extra fasting, because clearly the devil was working overtime on her appearance. Cheekbones that could cut glass, eyes the colour of Tuscan wine, not that she was supposed to know what that looked like, hair that, when it escaped her wimple, fell in waves that seemed personally crafted by Satan to tempt the faithful. She was also smart, which was worse. Smart, beautiful women in convents are like matches in a gunpowder factory. Eventually, something's going to explode. She could read Latin better than the chaplain, which wasn't hard, since he learned it phonetically and thought lorem ipsum was a saint. She understood the theological debates that raged through letters between monasteries. She had opinions about transubstantiation that would have been fascinating if anyone cared what nuns thought about anything beyond obedience and embroidery. The convent itself was a monument to medieval architecture's commitment to making everyone miserable. Stone walls that held cold in winter and heat in summer, like they were specifically designed to maximize discomfort. Narrow windows that let in just enough light to see how grey everything was. Gardens that grew herbs for medicine and vegetables for pottage. The kind of meal that made you understand why gluttony was a sin. Who would want more of that? The other sisters were a mix of true believers, economic refugees, and women who'd discovered too late that marriage to Christ came with fewer benefits than advertised. Sister Agnes, who'd been there 40 years and spoke only in biblical quotations. Sister Marie, who claimed to have visions but was probably just malnourished. Sister Catherine, who brewed ale strong enough to make you forget you were wearing a habit. They lived together in enforced harmony, which is like regular harmony but with more passive-aggressive prayer requests. Enter Sir Rowland the Ridiculous, not his actual name, but he earned it. A knight who'd been injured in some pointless war over who owned which muddy field in France. The 100 Years' War was in one of its many intermissions, which meant knights had to find other ways to get heroically injured. A tournament, probably, where men hit each other with sticks to prove they could hit each other with sticks. Very noble, very stupid. He came to the convent seeking medical attention because medieval hospitals were just places where you went to die faster, while convents actually had herbs and nuns who knew which ones wouldn't kill you immediately. The local monastery had physicians, but they were busy treating actually important people. A minor knight with a major wound got the B team. Nuns who learned medicine from other nuns who learned it from Arabic texts they weren't supposed to have. The wound was impressive in its stupidity. A gash from shoulder to chest, the kind that happened when you forgot armour had gaps and your opponent didn't. It was infected because medieval wound care usually involved dirt, prayer, and whatever was handy. He was fevered, delirious, and about 3 days from meeting his maker in a particularly embarrassing way. Sister Benedetta was assigned to tend his wounds. Big mistake. Huge. You don't put a 23-year-old woman who's been locked up for 9 years in close proximity to a knight who looks like he wrestles bears, for fun and wins. Even half dead and fully delirious. Sir Roland had the kind of presence that made you reconsider your vows. Broad shoulders that suggested regular sword work. Hands scarred from battle, but gentle when the fever made him think she was his mother. A jaw that could cut glass even when slack with unconsciousness. For 3 days, she cleaned his wounds with wine that actually contained alcohol, not whatever Christians were calling wine. She applied poultices of herbs that Arab physicians had been using for centuries, while European doctors were still recommending prayer and bloodletting. She sat with him through the fever, cooling his head with cloths dipped in spring water, listening to him ramble about battles that probably didn't happen the way he remembered them. Medieval medical care was intimate by necessity. You couldn't treat a chest wound from across the room. She had to touch him, skin to skin, to clean the infection. Had to lean close to check his breathing. Had to hold him down when the fever made him thrash. Her hands on his bare chest, feeling his heart race like a trapped bird. Each touch was medicinal, necessary. Absolutely not the kind of thing she thought about later during Compline. He survived because this story would be very short otherwise. The fever broke on the 4th day, leaving him weak but lucid. Lucid enough to realize that an angel was tending his wounds. That's what he called her, because medieval men had 2 modes when it came to women, demon or angel. No middle ground. Sister Benedetta corrected him. Not an angel, a bride of Christ, which should have ended any romantic notions, but instead seemed to intrigue him more. Recovery took weeks. Weeks where he was too weak to leave, but strong enough to talk, and talk he did. About the outside world that Sister Benedetta hadn't seen in 9 years. Battles in France where men fought over fields they'd never farm. Festivals in London where people danced until dawn, which sounded like heaven compared to matins at 2 a.m. Foods that weren't porridge, or bread, or porridge bread. The way the world smelled when it wasn't incense and stone and repressed desire. She found herself lingering in the infirmary, bringing him extra food that he didn't need, checking wounds that had healed, sitting beside his bed to ensure he was resting properly, which mainly involved him telling stories and her pretending she wasn't fascinated. He had a gift for narrative, making even mundane events sound like adventures. The time he got lost in a forest and survived on berries that turned out to be mildly poisonous. The tournament where everyone's armour rusted in the rain and they had to joust while squeaking like unoiled hinges. For her part, she corrected his theology. He thought saints were like minor gods you could bargain with. She explained intercession, badly, because she was distracted by the way candlelight played across his face. He asked about convent life, and she found herself being honest about the boredom, the cold, the way every day felt exactly the same until you couldn't remember if it was Tuesday or Thursday or the 7th circle of hell. They were careful, always in the infirmary where other sisters could see, always discussing appropriate topics like his recovery, or God's mercy, or whether the porridge was worse than usual today. The fact that their conversations gradually became about everything except his recovery was probably coincidence. The fact that other sisters started finding excuses not to be in the infirmary during her shifts was definitely coincidence. The first time they touched deliberately, not medically, it was over a book. He'd asked about the texts they used for medicine. She brought one, an Arabic treatise translated into Latin, full of knowledge the church pretended didn't exist. Their hands met over a diagram of the human heart, anatomically accurate but somehow feeling metaphorical. His fingers brushed hers, neither pulled away. The moment lasted forever, and not nearly long enough. By week 3, he could walk. By week 4, he should have left. He developed a mysterious relapse that fooled no one. The abbess, who'd survived 40 years of convent politics, knew exactly what was happening. But Sir Rowland had donated generously to the convent. Money talked louder than propriety, at least temporarily. She assigned older nuns to chaperone. Sisters who'd forgotten what desire felt like and fell asleep at their posts with suspicious regularity. They talked about impossible things. What if he wasn't a knight? What if she wasn't a nun? What if they lived in a world where people could choose who they loved? Dangerous conversations that danced around the obvious. They were falling in love in a place where love was the enemy of salvation. Every meeting was borrowed time. Every conversation was a step closer to disaster. Neither cared. When you've been starving, even poisoned berries taste sweet. The crisis came when he was finally, undeniably healed. No more excuses, no more mysterious relapses. He had to leave. The night before his departure, they met in the garden, supposedly so she could give him final medical instructions. Actually, so they could say goodbye to whatever this had been. Not love. Love required possibilities they didn't have, but something that made her question every vow she'd taken, and him consider taking vows himself just to stay near her. He kissed her. Once. Under a Tuscan moon that had seen worse sins, and would keep their secret. It was awkward, desperate, perfect. The kind of kiss that ruins you for all other kisses. The kind that makes you understand why the church fears the flesh. Because if one kiss could feel like salvation and damnation wrapped in a single moment, what could more do? He left the next morning. Had to. Staying would have destroyed her. The convent had ways of dealing with wayward nuns, and none of them were pleasant. He promised to return. She told him not to. They both knew they were lying. He rode away looking back until the convent disappeared. She watched from the bell tower until he was a speck on the horizon, then nothing at all. 3 months later, when it became apparent that their one night had left more than just memories and guilt behind, the abbess sent Sister Benedetta away, to a stricter convent in the mountains where the cells were colder and the rules were carved in stone. Literally, they had them on the walls. The kind of place where they specialised in reforming nuns who'd forgotten their husband was supposed to be incorporeal. What happened to her child? Records don't say. Medieval record-keeping got conveniently vague when it came to nuns as children who weren't supposed to exist. Probably raised as an orphan in the same convent, never knowing their mother was the sad woman in the corner who prayed louder than everyone else, like volume could make up for virtue, or maybe died at birth, which was merciful in its way. Better than living as proof of your mother's spectacular fall from grace. Sir Rowland? He died 2 years later in another pointless war, which was either divine justice or just medieval statistics. Knights had the life expectancy of mayflies with armour. But for one night in a Tuscan garden, a nun and a knight chose each other over heaven. And honestly, given the options medieval heaven was offering, eternal prayer, no touching, presumably endless porridge, who could blame them? Sometimes the greatest sin is the sweetest salvation. Sometimes a moment of genuine human connection is worth an eternity of cold stone and colder comfort. Sometimes love finds you in the last place you should look, and the worst time to see it. And sometimes, just sometimes, that makes it all the more precious. Sister Benedetta spent the rest of her life in that mountain convent, praying for forgiveness she probably didn't want. But on cold nights, when the wind howled through the stones, like the voice of God expressing disappointment, she remembered warm hands and terrible jokes, and the way moonlight looked on armour. And, in those moments, she smiled. The other nuns thought she was having visions. Let them think it. The truth was better. She was remembering the night she chose to be human. Just once, it was enough. But if you think a nun falling for a knight was scandalous, that was nothing compared to what happened when the Crusades decided to add cultural exchange to their military agenda. Because when you send thousands of young men to foreign lands to fight for God, sometimes they discover that the enemy has daughters. Beautiful, educated, definitely not supposed to talk to Christians' daughters. The problem with sending knights to the Holy Land wasn't the heat, the disease, or even the Saracens with their disturbingly effective military tactics. The problem was that the enemy turned out to be human. Worse, they turned out to be sophisticated, educated humans with libraries that made European castles look like mud huts with delusions. And some of them were women. Beautiful, brilliant women who made European ladies look like they'd been raised by particularly dim wolves. Sir Geoffrey of Bordeaux discovered this in 1345, when a skirmish outside Jerusalem went wrong in the most embarrassing way possible. He was there doing what crusader knights did best, killing infidels, claiming it was for God, and trying not to die of dysentery. He was terrible at the first, ambivalent about the second, and surprisingly successful at the third. Right up until the moment his horse decided to investigate a suspicious bush that turned out to be hiding 3 Saracen archers. The horse died immediately, which was inconvenient. Geoffrey flew through the air with all the grace of a trebuchet stone, landing headfirst against a rock that had been waiting since the dawn of time for this exact moment. When he woke up, he was in Damascus, prisoner of Emir Yusuf ibn Ahmad, who collected Christian knights like some people collect stamps. Except, stamps don't eat as much and complain less about the accommodations. The emir's palace was a revelation. Europeans built castles for defence, thick walls, narrow windows, everything designed to keep people out. Muslims built palaces for living, courtyards with fountains, gardens that actually grew things besides medicinal herbs and disappointment, rooms that caught breezes and light, like they were designed by someone who understood joy. It was unsettling. The enemy wasn't supposed to live better than you. Geoffrey was kept in what could generously be called a prison, and accurately be called nicer than most French castles. He had a room with an actual bed, not just straw with pretensions, windows that let in light, water for washing that didn't have visible things swimming in it. It was deeply confusing. Where was the torture, the dramatic suffering? How was he supposed to maintain proper crusader hatred when they kept giving him fresh fruit? Enter Zahra al-Andalus, the emir's daughter. 18 years old, educated in ways that would make European nobles weep with envy, and absolutely forbidden to interact with Christian prisoners beyond ensuring they didn't die before ransom negotiations. She spoke Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin, because apparently Muslim women were allowed to have brains. She'd read texts that Europeans wouldn't discover for another century. She understood mathematics beyond 1 + 1 = 2, unless you're calculating taxes, then it equals whatever the Lord says. Her official job was medical supervision. Make sure the valuable prisoners stayed valuable. Her unofficial job was to be brilliant and beautiful in a way that made Christian knights question their entire worldview. She was very good at both jobs. Geoffrey spoke French, bad Latin, and Arabic so terrible it was almost a separate language. His first attempt at communication went something like, "Water, give me you now blessing of Christ." Zara's response was to laugh, not the polite titter of a noblewoman, but actual laughter, like she'd just watched a dog try to play chess. Then she corrected his grammar. In French. Perfect. Accented but fluent French. Turned out her education included languages Christians didn't think Muslims knew existed. She'd learned French from merchants, Spanish from scholars, even some German from a very lost crusader who'd stayed for the library. The idea that the enemy could speak your language better than you spoke theirs was disturbing. It suggested they might be winning in ways that didn't involve swords. Their lessons started as language exchange. She taught him proper Arabic. He taught her French profanity, which she found hilarious and completely inappropriate. They used medical checkups as cover, though checking someone's health doesn't usually require 2-hour discussions about poetry. Arabic poetry, which made French verse look like someone hitting rocks together and calling it music. She introduced him to Ibn Rushd's commentaries on Aristotle. He hadn't even known Muslims read Aristotle, let alone improved on him. She explained Islamic philosophy like it was obvious that faith and reason could coexist. He argued Christian theology with the confidence of someone who'd never actually read the Bible in Latin. They debated whether God cared more about what you believed or what you did. Neither won, but the arguments were exhilarating. Days turned to weeks, turned to months. Geoffrey healed from injuries that should have killed him, then developed mysterious new ailments that required continued medical supervision. Very mysterious. Very convenient. Zara prescribed treatments that involved lots of conversation, and surprisingly, little actual medicine. The emir, busy with actual wars, didn't notice his daughter was spending hours discussing platonic ideals with a man who'd come to kill her people. The first time they touched without medical pretense, it was over a chess game. She was teaching him shatranj, the ancestor of chess, where the queen could only move one square because even board games had opinions about female power. Their hands met over a carved ivory piece. Both froze. Both knew this crossed from dangerous to insane. In the heartbeat before they pulled apart, entire futures flickered and died. They started meeting in the palace gardens after dark, supposedly so she could show him medicinal plants that only bloomed at night. Actually, so they could pretend the impossible was possible. Under Syrian stars that didn't care about the god you prayed to, they talked about everything except the obvious, that a crusader and a Saracen falling in love was like fire and water deciding to marry. Poetic, brief, and ending badly for everyone. She told him about Islamic science, how they'd preserved Greek knowledge while Europe was burning it, how algebra was an Arabic word because Muslims invented it while Christians were still counting on their fingers, how they had surgical techniques that didn't involve prayer and amputation as the only options. He told her about French seasons, where water turned solid and fell from the sky, about forests so thick you could walk for days without seeing sun, about a world that wasn't all sand and stone and wall. They fell in love incrementally, then completely. She loved his terrible Arabic and willingness to learn. He loved her laugh and the way she made him feel stupid in productive ways. She loved that he questioned his own beliefs. He loved that she had beliefs worth questioning. It was the kind of love that only happens when everything says it shouldn't. The forbidden fruit really does taste sweeter, even when you know it's poison. 6 months into his captivity, they made a choice that would horrify both their peoples. They decided to run. Her plan, because while Geoffrey was brave with a sword, he was useless at intrigue. She arranged for guards to be conveniently absent, for horses to be mysteriously available, for supplies to appear that would last the journey to Christian-held Acre. The only condition take her with him. The night they ran, Damascus was celebrating some victory over some other group of crusaders. The palace was drunk on success and actual wine, despite the Quranic prohibition. They slipped out, dressed as merchants, her hair hidden, his pale skin darkened with walnut dye. 2 people playing dress-up with their lives as the stakes. They made it 3 days. 3 days of riding toward a future that couldn't possibly exist. 3 days of pretending that love could overcome the fact that their people had been killing each other for 200 years. 3 days before her father's guards caught up with them at a caravanserai outside Tiberias. The smart thing would have been to surrender, to beg for mercy, to blame it all on enchantment or temporary madness. Instead, Geoffrey drew his sword and prepared to die, defending a woman his own people would call an infidel. Zara stepped in front of him and told her father's guards that if they wanted him, they'd have to go through her. Medieval standoffs weren't like movie standoffs. They were ugly, brutal, and usually ended with everyone dead. But Zara was the emir's favourite daughter, and even hardened soldiers hesitate when faced with explaining to their boss why they killed his beloved child. The compromise was elegant in its cruelty. Geoffrey would be released, sent back to the Crusaders with a message about the emir's mercy. Zahra would return to Damascus. They would never see each other again. If they tried, both would die, and not quickly. He went back to France, where he spent the rest of his life refusing to remarry and writing terrible poetry about desert roses. She was married off to a governor in Cairo, where she had 7 children and never wrote poetry again. They say she named her first son Geoffrey, but told everyone it was Jafar. Close enough to remember, different enough to survive. 2 lives ruined by 3 days of impossible hope. But for those 3 days, a Christian knight and a Muslim princess proved that love doesn't care about the God you pray to. It just cares that you're stupid enough to try. Speaking of stupid, nothing quite compared to what happened when men who'd taken literal vows of celibacy discovered that those vows were more like suggestions when the right woman walked into their cloistered little world. Because if crossing religious lines was dangerous, breaking vows to God himself was basically sending him an engraved invitation to smite you creatively. Of all the spectacularly bad romantic decisions in medieval history, none quite matches the audacious stupidity of Peter Abelard and Heloise. Their story has everything. Brilliant minds, terrible choices, secret marriage, violent castration, and enough letters to make modern texting relationships look emotionally stunted. It's the kind of love story that makes Romeo and Juliet look like a minor misunderstanding. Paris, 1115. The university isn't officially a university yet, just a collection of smart people arguing about God in Latin while trying not to die of various medieval ailments. Peter Abelard is the rock star of the theology world, if rock stars wore rough wool and debated the nature of the Trinity. At 36, he's famous for 2 things: his brilliant mind and his even more brilliant arrogance. He's the kind of teacher who destroys his opponent's arguments so thoroughly they need counselling afterward. Students flock to him. Other masters hate him. He's basically academic cocaine, thrilling, addictive, and probably not good for you. Enter Heloise, 17 years old, which in medieval terms makes her practically middle-aged. Her parents are dead, because medieval parents had the survival rate of Game of Thrones characters. She lives with her uncle Fulbert, a canon at Notre Dame who loves 2 things: his niece and his reputation, not necessarily in that order. Heloise isn't your typical medieval noble girl. She reads Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. She writes poetry that doesn't make people cringe. She debates theology like she's getting paid for it. In a world where most noble women are educated just enough to read their prayer books and sign their names, she's basically a supernatural phenomenon. Beautiful too, which is almost unfair. Smart or beautiful was usually enough to cause problems. Both together, that's just asking for disaster. Uncle Fulbert, in a decision that proves intelligence doesn't run in families, hires Abelard as her private tutor. Because what could possibly go wrong with putting a 17-year-old girl alone in a room with a charismatic older man who's famous for his way with words? It's like leaving a pyromaniac alone with matches and wondering why everything's on fire. The tutoring sessions start professionally. Latin grammar, Greek philosophy, Hebrew scripture, for about 5 minutes. Then Abelard discovers that Heloise's mind is as attractive as her face, which for a professional intellectual is basically kryptonite. She challenges his arguments. She catches his logical fallacies. She makes jokes in dead languages. He's doomed. Their own accounts of what happened next are hilariously different. Abelard, writing years later, claims he seduced her as an intellectual challenge. Like she was a particularly difficult theological problem he needed to solve with his penis. Heloise, in her letters, basically calls bullshit on this narrative. She wanted him just as much, maybe more. The student-teacher power dynamic? She was the one with the power, and they both knew it. Medieval love affairs required creativity. You couldn't just swipe right and meet for coffee. Every moment alone had to be orchestrated like a military campaign. Abelard gave her extra lessons, which is the medieval equivalent of Netflix and chill. Uncle Fulbert, bless his oblivious heart, was delighted. His niece was getting the best education money could buy. The fact that the curriculum had expanded to include anatomy was a detail he missed. They were not subtle. Love makes people stupid, and smart people in love are the stupidest of all. Abelard started writing her love songs. In public, he'd sing them in the streets, like a very educated, very horny troubadour. The songs were, supposedly, about abstract philosophical concepts, but everyone knew, when you're singing about the divine essence of beauty that transcends mortal understanding, while staring directly at your student, even medieval people can connect the dots. Heloise got pregnant, because of course she did. Medieval birth control was basically hope for the best, or herbs that might prevent pregnancy, but will definitely give you explosive diarrhea. Neither option was foolproof. Abelard's solution was characteristic. He kidnapped her. Not in a criminal way, more in a let's run away to my sister's house in Brittany before your uncle notices your expanding waistline way. Medieval problem, solving at its finest. She gave birth to a son they named Astrolabe. Yes, they named their child after a scientific instrument. It's like naming your kid GPS or smartphone. Even by medieval standards, where people named their children things like Fulbert and Engelbert without irony, Astrolabe was pushing it. The poor kid probably spent his entire life explaining that, yes, that was really his name, and no, his parents weren't drunk when they chose it. Uncle Fulbert, meanwhile, had noticed his niece's sudden interest in visiting relatives she'd never mentioned before. When he found out the truth, his reaction was measured and reasonable. Just kidding. He went completely medieval on everyone. Death threats were issued. Swords were sharpened. The family honour was defended with the kind of enthusiasm that makes you understand why medieval life expectancy was so short. Abelard's solution to the uncle problem was marriage. Secret marriage, because openly marrying would ruin his career. Medieval scholars were supposed to be celibate. not because God demanded it, but because wives were expensive and academia paid poorly. Some things never change. Heloise argued against it. Not because she didn't love him, but because she loved him too much to ruin his career. She wrote these incredible letters about how marriage would domesticate their passion, turn their cosmic love into something ordinary. She'd rather be his mistress than his wife. Medieval feminism was complicated. They married anyway, secretly, with Uncle Fulbert's grudging permission, which should have been a red flag. Uncle Fulbert immediately started telling everyone about the marriage, probably while cackling maniacally. Abelard denied it. Heloise denied it. Uncle Fulbert insisted. It was like a medieval Twitter feud, but with more Latin and higher stakes. The situation deteriorated faster than meat in summer. Abelard sent Heloise to a convent for her safety, which she took about as well as you'd expect. Uncle Fulbert interpreted this as abandonment. His niece, ruined and discarded like yesterday's porridge. Something had to be done. Something dramatic. Something that would make Game of Thrones writers take notes. Late one night, Uncle Fulbert's hired thugs broke into Abelard's room. What happened next is best described as targeted violence, or very specific assault, or the reason Abelard's singing voice went up 3 octaves. They castrated him. Just straight up medieval justice, delivered sharp and surgical. Well, probably not that surgical. Medieval surgery was more enthusiastic than precise. The aftermath was spectacular. Abelard, now physically incapable of the sin he was accused of, became a monk, not by choice. When you've been publicly castrated for sleeping with your student, career options narrow considerably. Heloise became a nun, also not by choice. When your secret husband has been castrated, and your uncle has proven he's capable of hiring genital-targeting assassins, convent life suddenly seems reasonable. But here's where their story gets really interesting. Separated by monastic walls and missing body parts, they started writing letters. Not just, "How are you, I'm fine" letters. These were philosophical treatises disguised as love letters, or love letters disguised as philosophical treatises. Thousands of words about the nature of love, sin, redemption, and whether their passion was worth Abelard's testicles. Spoiler: opinions differed. Abelard wrote about finding God through suffering, how his castration was actually a blessing, freeing him from carnal desires to focus on the divine. Heloise wrote back, calling him an idiot. Not in those words, because she was too educated for simple insults. She crafted elaborate arguments about how she'd rather be his whore than God's bride, how she still burned for him, how her prayers were interrupted by memories of their tutorials. Medieval sexting, but make it theological. They wrote for 20 years. Him in his monastery, trying to be holy and failing. Her in her convent, succeeding at everything except forgetting him. She became an abbess, running her convent with the same brilliant efficiency she'd once applied to seducing her tutor. He became a controversial theologian, because castration doesn't cure being an argumentative jackass. Their letters were copied, shared, studied. Medieval Europe's guilty pleasure reading. Heloise outlived him by 20 years. When she died, they buried her next to him, because even death couldn't keep them apart. Legend says when they opened his tomb to add her body, his corpse reached out to embrace her, which is definitely not true, but makes a better ending than 2 dead intellectuals continue decomposing in proximity. Their letters survive. You can read them today, 900 years later, and feel uncomfortable about how little has changed. The passion, the regret, the philosophical attempts to justify terrible decisions, the raw humanity of 2 brilliant people who destroyed their lives for love. and spent decades arguing about whether it was worth it. Was it worth it? Abelard, post-castration, said no. Heloise, till her dying day, said yes. The church said definitely no, and used their story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of education and proximity. Modern readers say, depends on your perspective, on genital integrity versus eternal love. But in 1115, in a room in Paris, none of that mattered. There was just a teacher and his student discovering that some lessons can't be unlearned, some bells can't be unrung, and some loves, no matter how disastrous, burn so bright they illuminate centuries. Even if they do cost you your testicles. Not all forbidden love in medieval times involved God or castration. Sometimes it was just about money, class, and the revolutionary idea that poor people might have feelings too. Take the story of Lady Isabel de Clare and William the Fletcher. 1367 England, where the Black Death had recently reshuffled society like a deck of cards soaked in blood. Lady Isabel was everything a noble lady should be. 16, beautiful, educated enough to seem accomplished, but not enough to have opinions. Her father owned half of Gloucestershire, and the other half owed him money. She was destined to marry someone equally noble, equally wealthy, and equally committed to keeping the bloodlines pure and the peasants in their place. William the Fletcher made arrows. That's it. That's his entire biography, according to official records. Made arrows. Lived above his workshop. Didn't die of plague, which in 1367 was an achievement worth noting. He was 22, literate because his mother had been a merchant's daughter before. Love and bad decisions reduced her to marrying an archer, and handsome, in the way that makes noble ladies suddenly very interested in archery equipment. Their paths should never have crossed. Medieval society was stratified like a lasagna made of oppression, nobles on top, covered in gold leaf, merchants in the middle, seasoned with aspiration, peasants at the bottom, soaking up all the grease. But the Black Death had killed so many people that the layers were getting mixed up. Suddenly, skilled craftsmen were rare, valuable, almost human. Lady Isabel met William when her father commissioned arrows for his guards. Not that he couldn't afford to buy them from established suppliers, but William's arrows were special. They flew straighter, hit harder, lasted longer. In a world where your life might depend on your archer's equipment, quality mattered more than social protocol. Sometimes, she accompanied her father to the workshop because medieval noble women had nothing better to do than supervise purchases they didn't understand. William was supposed to bow, avert his eyes, and speak only when spoken to. He did none of these things. He explained his craft like she might actually understand it. Showed her how he selected wood, shaped shafts, attached fletching, treated her like a person interested in arrows rather than a decorative object that happened to have opinions. For a girl who'd spent 16 years being treated like an expensive vase, this was intoxicating. Someone was talking to her, not around her. William didn't know she was supposed to be stupid. He assumed intelligence until proven otherwise, which in medieval noble society was borderline revolutionary. She started finding reasons to visit the workshop. Her father's guards needed more arrows. Different arrows. Special arrows for special purposes that definitely existed and weren't made up. William, who wasn't an idiot, knew exactly what was happening. A noble lady didn't need to personally inspect every arrow purchase. But he played along because when someone that far above your station shows interest, you don't question it. You just thank whatever saint protects poor craftsmen from their own stupidity. Their conversations evolved from arrows to everything. He told her about his work, his life, his mother's stories of being a merchant's daughter. She told him about court, about the boredom of being ornamental, about dreams that didn't involve marrying someone who looked like a foot with lands attached. They were from different worlds, but loneliness is universal. So is the human need to be seen as more than your function. The first time he touched her hand, it was to correct her grip on a bow, purely instructional. The fact that the instruction took 17 times longer than necessary was coincidental. The fact that she suddenly needed extensive archery lessons was also coincidental. Medieval coincidences were very convenient like that. For 3 months, they maintained the fiction. She was interested in archery. He was providing professional instruction. The fact that professional instruction involved long walks, where arrows were mysteriously never discussed, irrelevant. The fact that she started dressing simpler, prettier, younger when she visited, also irrelevant. The fact that he started washing more frequently and owned a shirt that wasn't covered in wood shavings, complete coincidence. But medieval towns were small, and gossip travelled faster than plague. Someone noticed. Someone always notices. A guard mentioned to another guard that Lady Isabel spent a lot of time at the Fletchers. That guard mentioned it to a servant. That servant mentioned it to another servant. By the time it reached her father's ears, Lady Isabel wasn't just visiting the Fletcher. She was bearing his children, practicing witchcraft, and possibly turning into a peasant through proximity. Lord de Clare's reaction was swift and medieval. William's workshop was mysteriously burned down. Very mysterious. So mysterious that everyone knew exactly who did it and why. William himself was arrested on charges of theft. What did he steal? Unclear. When? Unspecified. But medieval justice didn't require details when class warfare was involved. The trial was a formality. William the Fletcher, accused of stealing from his betters. The fact that what he'd actually stolen was conversations with a noble lady was creatively interpreted as theft of property, because noble women were property, and damaging property values through inappropriate association was definitely criminal. Lady Isabel tried to intervene. Mistake. Noble ladies didn't intervene in justice unless the accused was noble, related, or both. Her protests just confirmed the inappropriate relationship. Her father's response was elegant in its cruelty. William would be branded and exiled, not killed, because he was too valuable a craftsman, but marked forever as a thief, unable to work in any respectable town. The branding happened publicly. Because medieval justice loved an audience, they heated the iron until it glowed like a tiny sun, pressed it into his hand while the crowd watched. Some cheered because mob mentality is timeless. Some stayed silent because they knew this wasn't about theft. Lady Isabel watched from a window because of course she did. When you've destroyed someone's life, the least you can do is witness the destruction. But here's where the story gets interesting, because William the Fletcher, freshly branded and officially exiled, didn't leave. He set up shop in the forest outside town, technically exiled, practically still there, making arrows for anyone who'd buy them, which turned out to be everyone. Because branded or not, his arrows were still the best. And in a world where French invasions were always possible, good arrows mattered more than good behaviour. Lady Isabel was married within the month to Sir Reginald of something or other, a man with lands, titles, and the personality of wet leather. The wedding was grand, the bride was beautiful. Everyone pretended not to notice. She looked like she was attending a funeral, which, in a way, she was. But medieval forests were big, and noble husbands were often absent. fighting wars, attending court, dying of various noble diseases. Lady Isabel developed a passion for hunting, very sudden, very intense, required frequent trips to the forest, alone because she was grieving her father's recent death. Medieval grief was very specific about requiring solitude in forests where exiled Fletchers might live. Their meetings were dangerous, stupid, and absolutely worth it. A branded craftsman and a married noble woman, stealing hours in a forest that belonged to neither of them. He showed her how to survive outside society's cage. She brought him news of the world he'd been exiled from. They built something between them that wasn't quite love, wasn't quite friendship, but was absolutely forbidden. Years passed. Sir Reginald died in battle, which was considerate of him. Lady Isabel became a wealthy widow with options. She could remarry, enter a convent, or do something completely insane, like use her wealth to establish a workshop for a formerly exiled Fletcher who made excellent arrows and even better conversation. The records get vague here, as medieval records do when things get uncomfortable. But William the Fletcher's workshop expanded, became successful, employed others. And Lady Isabel, the wealthy widow, became his most frequent customer, visiting daily to inspect arrows that must have been very complex given how long inspection took. Did they marry? Records don't say. Medieval records were allergic to happy endings that violated social order, but they lived in the same town, in houses suspiciously close together, for 40 years. She never remarried. He never married at all. When they died, within weeks of each other, they were buried in the same churchyard. Different sections, because even death couldn't completely overcome class, but close enough that if bodies could walk, they'd find each other. Their graves are marked simply: Lady Isabel de Clare, widow. William Fletcher, arrow maker. No mention of the scandal. No hint of the love that survived branding, exile, and everything medieval society could throw at it. Just two people who happened to die in the same place at the same time after lives that definitely didn't intersect. But in the church records, there's an interesting note. Lady Isabel left money for prayers to be said for the soul of William, craftsman. A lot of money. The kind of money that suggests more than professional appreciation for well-made arrows. And William, who shouldn't have had any money to leave, somehow funded prayers for Isabel, Lady of Mercy. Medieval love stories don't always end with castration or convents. Sometimes they end with two graves in the same churchyard and prayers that echo through centuries. Sometimes the real rebellion isn't running away or dying dramatically. Sometimes it's staying put and living quietly with the person society says you can't have. Sometimes love isn't about grand gestures. It's about arrows that fly straight and conversations that matter, and building a life in the spaces between what's allowed and what's possible. Sometimes the best forbidden love stories are the ones where everyone pretends nothing happened, while leaving just enough evidence to prove that everything did. Of all the lines you couldn't cross in medieval Europe, the one between Christian and Jew was painted in blood, reinforced with law, and decorated with the kind of hatred that made the Montagues and Capulets look like friendly neighbours who just needed to talk things out. Which is why the story of Sarah the physician's daughter and Robert de Montfort is particularly spectacular in its stupidity. 1290, Oxford, where the Jewish community lived in their designated street-like exotic animals in the world's most depressing zoo. They could leave during the day, conduct business, make Christians rich through money lending, then return to their quarter before the gates closed. It was apartheid with extra steps and worse fashion requirements. Jews had to wear special badges, yellow circles, or pointed hats, so everyone knew who to blame when crops failed, or babies died, or Tuesday was disappointing. Sarah's father was a physician, which was one of the few prestigious jobs Jews were allowed. Christian doctors were mostly barber surgeons, who thought bleeding solved everything and washing hands was optional. Jewish doctors actually read medical texts, understood Arabic scholarship, and had this radical idea that maybe you should diagnose before you amputate. They were suspiciously good at keeping people alive, which was either divine blessing or devil worship, depending on whether you survived. Sarah learned medicine from her father because Jewish women weren't bound by Christian rules about female education being Satan's gateway drug. She could read Hebrew, Arabic, Latin, and probably Greek because overachievement runs in families. At 19, she knew more about the human body than most Christian doctors would learn in a lifetime of confidently killing patients. Robert de Montfort was everything a young Norman noble should be. 21, built like someone who'd been training for war since he could walk, owner of teeth that hadn't fallen out yet. His father held lands across 3 counties and owed money to exactly 0 Jews, which was rare and point of pride. Robert was in Oxford, studying at the university, which meant drinking, fighting, and occasionally attending lectures about why Aristotle was right about everything except that thing about women being failed men. He met Sarah when a tavern brawl went wrong. Tavern brawls going wrong was basically Tuesday in medieval Oxford, but this one was special. Someone had a knife. Robert had a face. The knife and face met in a way that suggested they shouldn't. His friends dragged him to the Jewish physician because Christian doctors looked at the wound and suggested prayer, which rarely reattaches noses. Sarah was the one who treated him. Her father was busy with another patient who discovered that mixing ale with wine with mead creates a poison that makes you wish for death. She cleaned Robert's wound with wine that actually contained alcohol, not whatever Christians were calling wine. She stitched the gash with silk thread so fine it was almost invisible. She didn't mention that touching a Christian man was technically forbidden by both their laws. He didn't mention that being touched by a Jewish woman was definitely forbidden by his. The thing about pain is it makes you honest. Robert, half delirious from blood loss, and whatever Sarah had given him for the agony, talked through the entire procedure about his studies, his family, his dreams of crusading that were really just dreams of travelling somewhere wine didn't taste like disappointment. Sarah, focused on not permanently disfiguring the prettiest face she'd ever stitched back together, found herself responding, telling him about medical texts, about treatments Christians considered witchcraft but were actually just washing things, about life in the quarter where every day was a balance between usefulness and survival. He came back the next day to have the wound checked. Very important, infections were deadly. The fact that the wound was healing perfectly was irrelevant. He came back the day after that too, and the next. Daily wound checks became the medieval equivalent of, "I need to return your sweater that you never lent me." Sarah knew, her father knew, Robert's friends definitely knew, but everyone pretended this was normal medical follow-up. Their conversations evolved from medical to everything. He brought her books from the university, pretending they were payment. She taught him Arabic numerals, which were clearly superior to Roman numerals, but Christians were suspicious because they came from Muslims. They debated theology, which was dangerous, philosophy, which was worse. And eventually, nothing at all, just sitting in comfortable silence while she changed bandages that didn't need changing on wounds that had already healed. The first time he touched her hand wasn't medical. She was reaching for a book he'd brought, something about astronomy that Christians thought was probably heretical but couldn't prove. Their fingers met over Ptolemy's theories about celestial spheres. Both froze. Both knew this, crossed from dangerous to insane. Neither pulled away. Medieval Oxford wasn't big. The Jewish quarter was smaller. Secret meetings were impossible, so they didn't try. He visited openly, brazenly, like a man who'd forgotten that fraternizing with Jews was social suicide. She treated him in full view of everyone, like a woman who'd forgotten that Christian attention was often fatal. They were seen, they were talked about, they were catastrophically unconcerned. The Jewish community reacted first. Sarah's father, who'd survived 3 pogroms and 2 expulsions, knew danger when he saw it wearing a handsome face. He forbade further contact. Sarah, in the tradition of daughters everywhere, agreed completely and then did exactly what she wanted. The Christian community took longer to notice because Robert's wound had healed, and surely he had no other reason to visit the Jewish quarter daily. But Oxford was a university town, which meant it was full of young men with too much education and not enough sense. Someone noticed Robert entering the Jewish quarter. Someone else noticed him, leaving hours later. Someone with a mathematical mind calculated how many wound checks a single cut required. The answer was not 57 and counting. The confrontation was inevitable. Robert's friends, concerned for his soul and social standing, staged an intervention. Did he know she was using Jewish magic? Was he aware that fraternizing with Christ killers was basically spitting on God? Had he considered that his father would literally murder him? Robert's response was to break the nose of the friend who called Sarah a Christ killer. In his defense, he knew from personal experience that noses could be fixed. The Jewish community's intervention was quieter but more effective. Sarah's father arranged a marriage. Jacob the goldsmith's son, a nice boy who'd never started a fight in his life and thought passion was something you felt about properly balanced ledgers. Sarah's response was to develop a sudden illness that prevented meeting her betrothed. Very sudden, very convenient, very obviously fake. But what could anyone do? The situation escalated when Robert did the stupidest thing possible. He went to the synagogue, on Sabbath, to formally ask for Sarah's hand in marriage. In Hebrew, he'd learned from her. It was romantic, grand, and so monumentally idiotic that even medieval people, who had pretty high tolerance for stupid, were impressed. The rabbi's response was measured. He didn't have Robert killed, which showed restraint. He just explained, slowly, like talking to a child who'd eaten paint, that conversion was required. That Christianity generally frowned on conversion to Judaism. That the church's version of frowning involved fire. That even if Robert converted, which would require circumcision at age 21, which was medically inadvisable and theologically complex, the community would never accept him because his family had probably killed Jews for entertainment. Robert's counter-offer was elegant in its simplicity. Sarah could convert to Christianity, marry him, live in his world where she'd never practice medicine again, never speak Hebrew, never see her family, and spend her life pretending she hadn't been born into a faith that his faith considered barely human. It was a generous offer, if you define generosity as destroying everything about a person except their body. Sarah's response was to laugh. Not cruel laughter, just the exhausted amusement of someone realizing that the man she loved had no idea who she actually was. Converting wasn't changing clothes. It was changing souls. And her soul, whatever Robert thought, wasn't negotiable. They met one last time in her father's surgery. Both sets of parents had made threats. The Jewish community was considering expelling her family. The Christian community was considering less subtle solutions. Romeo and Juliet had potions and daggers. Sarah and Robert had reality, which was worse. She gave him a gift, a medical text in Arabic, translated into Latin in her own hand. Margins filled with notes about treatments that might save lives if Christian doctors could overcome their prejudice against Jewish and Muslim knowledge. He gave her a ring, not a wedding ring, just a band of silver with no markings, no promises, no future, a memory shaped like possibility. He left Oxford that night. His father needed him home. Wars needed fighting. Appropriate marriages needed arranging. She heard he married a Norman girl who gave him 7 children and never once challenged his worldview. Very satisfactory. She married Jacob the goldsmith's son, who turned out to be kind if not exciting. They had 4 children who survived and 3 who didn't, which was a good ratio for medieval Jews. But 20 years later, when the Jews were expelled from England in 1290, Sarah's son found something in his mother's medical texts. A letter, never sent, written in Latin with handwriting that suggested the author had learned from someone who wrote right to left. It talked about procedures the writer had implemented, lives saved using techniques learned from the finest physician in Oxford. It was signed with an R, and nothing more. Sarah never spoke of Robert de Montfort. He never returned to Oxford. But somewhere in England, Christian patients survived because a Norman lord insisted his physicians wash their hands and use silk for sutures. Somewhere in France, where Sarah's family fled after the expulsion, Jewish children learned that knowledge was the only thing that crossed borders safely. Their love story ended where it began, in a surgery with healing and impossibility sitting side by side. But every life saved with techniques that shouldn't have crossed religious lines was a small victory. Every moment of understanding between Christian and Jew was a crack in walls built from centuries of hatred. They couldn't marry, couldn't convert, couldn't find a world where their love made sense, but they could pass on knowledge, could prove that 2 people from opposite sides of an uncrossable divide could see each other as human. In medieval terms, that was its own kind of miracle. Less romantic than dying for love, more useful than living in misery. Sometimes the best you can do is plant seeds in ground that won't accept them, hoping someday the soil will change. Sometimes forbidden love isn't about the lovers at all. It's about the ripples they leave behind, spreading outward through time, changing worlds in ways too small to see, but too important to stop. The problem with troubadours wasn't that they sang about love. Everyone sang about love. The problem was they made it sound good, made it sound like something worth having instead of a luxury you couldn't afford. Made noble ladies think about things like passion and choice, and whether their husbands really needed to smell like cheese and warfare all the time. Which is why the story of Beatrice de Toulouse and Giraud de Bornel was doomed from the first verse. 1223, southern France, where the troubadour tradition was in full swing and noble marriages were still basically livestock exchanges with better clothing. Beatrice was Countess of Toulouse in her own right, which was like being a unicorn that owned land. Female rulers existed, but were about as popular as the plague and twice as likely to cause upheaval. She'd inherited because her brothers had all died in various crusades, proving that testosterone and military strategy don't always mix well. At 32, she'd been married 3 times. First husband died in battle, which was standard. Second husband died of fever, which was also standard. Third husband died falling downstairs, which was suspicious, but investigating would have been inconvenient. She was rich, powerful, and absolutely done with husbands who treated her castle like a vacation home and her body like an air factory. Giraud de Bornel was nobody. Well, not nobody. He was the greatest troubadour of his generation, which meant he was famous in the way that Instagram influencers would be famous if Instagram involved loots and the constant threat of execution. He could make grown men cry with a ballad about lost love, could make noble ladies fan themselves with songs about desire that technically honoured courtly love traditions while obviously being about sex. He was 28, owned nothing but his voice and wit, and had the kind of dangerous charisma that made fathers lock up their daughters and wives suddenly develop interests in poetry. He came to Beatrice's court because that's what troubadours did. Travelled from castle to castle like medieval entertainment systems, singing for supper and hoping nobody took offence at their lyrics, and decided to get creative with sharp objects. Beatrice's court was known for being cultured, which meant the food was slightly better and the violence was mostly verbal. The first time Giraud performed for her, he sang the traditional songs, Knights and Ladies, Unrequited Love, the usual metaphors about roses and towers and hearts that burn like fires but chastely, always chastely. Beatrice listened with the polite boredom of someone who'd heard it all before. Beautiful voice, competent lyrics, nothing special. Then he sang something new. A song about a lady who ruled in her own right, who needed no knight to defend her because she wielded power like a sword, who chose her lovers like she chose her wines, for pleasure rather than politics. It was clearly about her. Everyone knew it was about her. In any other court, singing that would have gotten him thrown out at best, thrown off the walls at worst. Beatrice laughed, not the polite titter of a noble lady, but real laughter, like she'd forgotten she was supposed to be dignified. She asked him to sing it again, then asked him where he'd learned to see women as more than decorative baby makers. His answer was simple: by listening. Revolutionary concept in 1223. She kept him at court, officially as her troubadour, which was perfectly acceptable. Noble ladies had troubadours like they had jewellery, to show off at gatherings. Unofficially, as someone who could hold a conversation about something other than war, God, or the best way to breed horses. They talked about poetry, philosophy, the new Arabic texts filtering through Spain. He taught her to compose verses. She taught him that power could be wielded with words as effectively as swords. Medieval courts ran on gossip, like modern offices run on coffee. Everyone noticed when Beatrice started spending hours with her troubadour. Everyone noticed when she laughed at his jokes, real laughter, not the performative kind. Everyone especially noticed when she started writing poetry herself, verses about choosing joy over duty that made older nobles clutch their pearls, or whatever medieval nobles clutched when scandalized. The relationship stayed technically proper for months. He sang. She listened. They discussed art and politics with other people present. The fact that the other people gradually stopped attending these sessions was probably coincidence. The fact that the sessions moved from the Great Hall to her private solar was definitely coincidence. The fact that servants were told not to disturb these poetry lessons was absolutely, completely coincidental. The first time they kissed, it was over a manuscript of Ovid, arguing about whether love was madness or clarity. She said madness, obviously, look at Paris and Helen. He said clarity, finally seeing someone truly. The argument got heated. The manuscript got forgotten. The kiss was neither mad nor clear, just inevitable. Like rain after thunder, or death after life, or scandal after a countess starts kissing her troubadour. They were not subtle. Subtlety is for people with something to lose, and Beatrice had already lost 3 husbands and her patience with pretense. Giraud had never owned anything worth protecting, except his reputation, which was built on scandalous songs anyway. They walked in gardens together, rode out hunting with only the minimum guards, shared wine from the same cup at feasts, which was basically medieval first base. The nobles were appalled. Not because she took a lover, noble ladies took lovers like they took breath, carefully and when their husbands weren't looking, but because she took him publicly, acknowledged him, treated him like an equal rather than an amusing pet. She gave him gifts, not just the standard coins or clothing, but books, a horse, a small estate, which was like giving a commoner a crown, unthinkable. Her advisors staged interventions. Did she understand she was undermining the entire social order, that peasants might start thinking they were people, that other noble ladies might start choosing their own lovers based on compatibility rather than convenience? Beatrice's response was to commission a new song from Giraud about advisors who minded business that wasn't theirs. He performed it at dinner. The advisors were not amused. The church got involved because of course it did. The Bishop of Toulouse, who owed his position to Beatrice's patronage, suddenly remembered that adultery was a sin. The fact that Beatrice wasn't technically married anymore was irrelevant. Women were supposed to be chaste widows or faithful wives. Lustful countesses who wrote poetry about desire weren't in the manual. Beatrice's response was to threaten to audit the church's tax exemptions. Medieval power politics at their finest. The bishop remembered urgent business elsewhere. God's wrath was temporarily postponed. But you can't fight everyone forever. Her nobles were restless. Her neighbours were circling, sensing weakness. A countess who valued poetry over politics was a countess who might lose her lands. And in medieval terms, losing your lands was worse than losing your life. At least death was quick. The crisis came when King Louis offered her a 4th marriage. Political alliance. Mutual benefit. The groom was 40 years older, smelled like death warmed over, but owned strategic ports. The kind of marriage that made sense on parchment and nowhere else. Refusing would mean losing royal favour. Accepting would mean losing Giraud. She chose a 3rd option, retirement. Shocking, scandalous, brilliant retirement. She announced she was taking holy orders, not as a nun, she wasn't that desperate, but as a vowess, a religious woman living in the world. It meant she couldn't remarry, couldn't be forced to remarry, could live however she wanted, as long as she prayed occasionally and wore modest clothing. The nobles were furious but stuck. You couldn't argue with God, or at least with someone claiming God wanted them celibate. The king was annoyed but distracted by actual wars. The church was confused, but decided any vow was better than public adultery. Giraud officially left her service. Unofficially, moved into a house surprisingly close to hers. They lived separately, but together for 20 years. Him composing songs that were definitely about spiritual love, and not about the vowess who visited daily. Her writing poetry that was definitely about divine devotion, and not about the troubadour who still made her laugh. When she died, he sang at her funeral. A song about a lady who chose joy over duty, love over land, laughter over legacy. The nobles were scandalized one last time. The bishop pretended not to notice the tears on the troubadour's face. Everyone agreed it was a beautiful service for such a difficult woman. Giraud lived another 10 years, travelling from court to court, singing his songs. But the new ones were all about loss. about a countess who wielded power like poetry and loved like a revolution, about how some birds aren't meant for cages, even golden ones, about how the greatest nobility isn't in blood, but in choosing who you love and how you live. Medieval historians wrote her down as a cautionary tale, a woman who let passion override politics, a countess who forgot her duty, a scandal that threatened the social order. They missed the point entirely. Beatrice de Toulouse didn't forget her duty. She redefined it, decided her duty was to herself first, her happiness second, and everyone else's opinions never. In a world where women were property and love was a luxury, she made herself the owner and love the currency. Not bad for a lady and a troubadour who just wanted to discuss poetry. Not bad at all. Sometimes forbidden love wasn't about religion or marriage or even adultery. Sometimes it was simply about the revolutionary idea that peasants were human beings with human feelings. Wild concept in 1381, when the peasants' revolt had just reminded nobles that the people who grew their food might have opinions about being treated like talking livestock. Which brings us to Edmund of Warwick and Rose the brewer's daughter. Edmund wasn't supposed to be heir to anything. Fourth son of the Earl of Warwick. He was destined for the church or an early death in someone else's war. But medieval life expectancy had opinions, and by the time he turned 20, his 3 older brothers were dead. Plague took one, tournament accident took another, and the third choked on a fishbone, proving that God has a sense of humour about succession planning. Suddenly Edmund went from spare to heir, from forgotten to important, from free to make his own mistakes, to having every breath monitored by people who cared very much about the continuation of the Warwick line. He handled it about as well as any 20-year-old handed massive responsibility without warning, which is to say, badly. Rose was everything Edmund wasn't. Daughter of a brewer, which, in medieval terms, meant her family was rich by peasant standards, but still peasants. She could read and write because her mother had been a merchant's daughter who married for love and regretted it every time the tax collectors came. Rose helped run the brewery, which meant she understood numbers, negotiation, and how to handle drunk men who thought breasts came with the beer price. At 19, she was pretty in the way that made nobles nervous. Peasants weren't supposed to be beautiful. It upset the natural order, suggested that maybe God didn't actually sort people by worth at birth. She had the kind of sharp wit that in a noble woman would be called intelligence, but in a peasant was called insolence. She also had absolutely zero patience for nobles, who thought their birth made them better than the people who kept them alive. They met when Edmund's horse threw a shoe near her family's brewery. Not romantically threw a shoe, violently threw it, along with Edmund, who landed in a puddle that was definitely not just water. Medieval streets were essentially open sewers with pretensions. His guards wanted to burn down the brewery for the offence of existing near where their lord fell. Edmund, covered in substances he didn't want to identify, just wanted to get clean. Rose was the one who brought him water and cloths. Not because she was impressed by nobility, but because her father would kill her if she let a future earl die of embarrassment outside their door. Bad for business. She helped him clean up with the kind of practical efficiency that suggested she'd dealt with worse, probably had. Brewery work involved a lot of substances that shouldn't mix but did. She didn't recognize him, or pretended not to. Treated him like any other customer who'd had an unfortunate encounter with gravity and sewage. Made jokes about nobles who couldn't stay on horses. Suggested maybe they should walk more, get to know the ground they claimed to own. Edmund, who'd spent his entire life surrounded by people who treated him like he shot gold and pissed holy water, was enchanted. He came back the next day, for beer, officially. His guards were confused. Nobles didn't drink in common breweries. They had people to bring them better beer in cleaner places. But Edmund insisted. The beer was exceptional, worth the journey, worth the smell, worth the risk of mixing with commoners who might have opinions. Rose served him herself, still pretending not to know who he was, or genuinely not caring. She critiqued his drinking technique, suggested he was holding the mug wrong, offered to teach him how common people managed to drink without drowning. The guards were horrified. Edmund was delighted. He'd never been insulted so charmingly in his life. The visits became regular, daily, sometimes twice daily. The brewery became Edmund's favourite place, which was like the Queen declaring her favourite spot was a pigsty. His father noticed. His guards definitely noticed. The entire noble community noticed that the future Earl of Warwick was spending significant time in a place that served people who shouldn't exist in his awareness. But Edmund had discovered something revolutionary. He liked being treated like a person instead of a title. Rose talked to him about brewing, about business, about the art of making something from nothing. She didn't simper or flatter or pretend his jokes were funny when they weren't. She laughed when he was actually clever, which wasn't often but improved with practice. She made him work for her approval, instead of offering it like tribute. The first time he tried to give her a gift, a small ring, nothing scandalous, she laughed, asked if he thought she was for sale, explained that peasant women who accepted jewellery from nobles usually ended up pregnant and abandoned, that she'd rather have his respect than his gold. Edmund, who'd never had a gift, refused in his life, fell completely in love. The relationship evolved from customer and server to something more dangerous. He started helping with brewery work, lifting barrels, stirring mash, learning that making beer was actually hard work and not just peasant magic. She taught him about real life, how taxes worked when you were the one paying them, how justice looked different when you couldn't afford it, how nobles looked from below and the view wasn't flattering. They were careful, but not careful enough. Medieval privacy was a myth, especially for nobles covered in mash and laughing with peasant girls. Someone saw, someone always sees. Word reached Edmund's father that his heir was not just visiting a brewery, but working in one with his hands, like a common labourer, with a girl who was definitely common and definitely not suitable for anything but a quick tumble and a payoff. The Earl's response was measured and medieval. He had Rose's father arrested for tax evasion. Every business evaded taxes. It was basically the national sport. But usually, nobles didn't care unless they needed leverage. The message was clear. Stop corrupting my heir, or your father rots in prison. Edmund tried to intervene. Mistake. Nobles intervening for peasants just confirmed inappropriate attachment. His father's response was to accelerate Edmund's betrothal to Lady Margaret of somewhere important. The wedding would be next month. The bride was appropriate, noble, and had the personality of furniture, perfect Earl's wife material. Rose's response was to do what peasants always did when nobles destroyed their lives: endure. She kept the brewery running while her father sat in prison, kept serving beer to people who whispered about her shame, kept her head high, even when noble ladies came specifically to stare at the peasant who'd thought she could rise above her station. But Edmund, raised on stories of chivalry and honour, decided to do something spectacularly stupid and completely in character. He publicly refused the betrothal in front of the king. At court, declared he would marry whom he chose, or no one at all. That nobility of character mattered more than nobility of blood. That he'd rather be a brewmaster than an earl, if being an earl meant abandoning honour. The court's reaction was what you'd expect. Shock, horror, and the kind of excited whispering that meant this gossip would feed the nobility for months. The king was amused in the way cats are amused by mice before eating them. Edmund's father aged approximately 30 years in 30 seconds. Lady Margaret fainted, either from relief or insult. The fallout was swift and brutal. Edmund was disinherited on the spot, stripped of titles, lands, expectations, from heir to nothing in one grand gesture. His father probably would have had him killed, but kinslaying was frowned upon and there were witnesses. Instead, Edmund was cast out, told to go be a peasant if he loved them so much. He went to the brewery. Where else? Showed up at Rose's door with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a skill set completely unsuited to actual work. Rose looked at him. Former heir to an earldom, currently unemployed and unemployable, and did what any sensible peasant woman would do. She laughed. Then she handed him a broom, and told him to make himself useful. They married, because why not? He was nobody now. She was nobody with a brewery. In medieval mathematics, that equaled a match. Her father was released from prison because without Edmund to leverage, keeping him was pointless. The family accepted their daughter's ridiculous husband because he was strong enough to lift barrels and smart enough to learn the trade. It wasn't easy. Noble refugees make terrible peasants. Edmund had to learn that work started before noon, that meals weren't guaranteed, that being cold, tired and hungry was normal, not a crisis requiring immediate intervention. But he learned. Love is excellent motivation, and starvation is better. They had 6 children who grew up not knowing their father had almost been an earl, who learned brewing and business instead of heraldry and warfare, who married merchants and craftsmen and never wondered if they deserved better. Edmund became a master brewer, renowned for an ale he named Noble's Folly. Customers thought it was clever. They didn't know it was autobiography. He died at 52, old for a peasant, young for an earl. Rose lived another decade, running the brewery with children who'd inherited their father's height and their mother's sense. When she died, they found letters hidden in her things. Love poems in handwriting, too educated for a brewer, signed simply E, and speaking of a rose that bloomed in common soil, but smelled sweeter than any noble garden. History forgot Edmund of Warwick. No chronicles record the Earl's 4th son who chose love over lands. No songs celebrate the noble who became a brewer. But in the alehouses of Warwickshire, for generations, they served Noble's Folly, and sometimes, after enough cups, someone would tell the story of the Earl who fell off his horse and into a better life. Not all forbidden love ends in tragedy. Sometimes it ends in ale and laughter, and children who never know they could have been nobles. Sometimes falling from grace is really rising to joy. Sometimes the best rebellion against an unjust system is to live happily within it, proving every day that worth has nothing to do with birth. Sometimes love isn't about what you're willing to die for, it's about what you're willing to live for. Even if what you're living for is a brewery, a sharp-tongued woman, and the revolutionary idea that happiness matters more than heraldry. Speaking of choosing love over nobility, sometimes the choice was literal. Sometimes a noble looked at their life of privilege and power and said, "You know what? I'd rather make beer with someone who actually likes me." Because, in the end, what good is a castle if it feels like a prison. Enter Edmund of Warwick, fourth son of the Earl of Warwick, who in 1381 was living proof that God has a twisted sense of humour about succession planning. He wasn't supposed to inherit anything. Fourth sons got two career options, the church or an early death in someone else's war. Edmund had chosen option 3, disappointing everyone by surviving while being terrible at both prayer and warfare. But then, medieval mortality rates did their thing. His oldest brother died in a tournament, proving that hitting each other with sticks for entertainment had drawbacks. The second brother caught plague because plague didn't care about your nobility. The third choked on a fishbone during a feast, which was embarrassing for everyone involved, especially the fish. Suddenly, Edmund went from spare part to heir apparent, like winning a lottery nobody wanted to enter. At 20, he was spectacularly unprepared for responsibility. He'd spent his youth doing what fourth sons did, learning just enough Latin to fake prayers, just enough swordplay to not stab himself, and just enough courtly manners to not embarrass the family at dinners. Now he was expected to manage estates, marry strategically, and produce heirs like his life depended on it, which it did. Medieval succession was serious business. The problem was, Edmund had spent his forgotten years developing dangerous habits, like thinking, and reading books that weren't just about God or war, and worst of all, talking to common people like they were human beings with interesting opinions. His father blamed the University of Oxford, where Edmund had spent 2 years before dropping out. Education was dangerous. It gave people ideas. Enter Rose, daughter of a brewer, which in medieval terms meant her family was rich by peasant standards, but still essentially livestock that could count. The brewery sat just outside Warwick Castle, perfectly positioned to supply the endless stream of ale required to make medieval life bearable. Her father had built the business from nothing, which in feudal economics was like performing magic. Peasants weren't supposed to have ambition. It confused the social order. Rose was 19, literate because her mother had been a merchant's daughter who married down for love and spent the rest of her life regretting it every tax season. She could read, write, and do mathematics without using her fingers, which made her more educated than half the nobility. She helped run the brewery, which meant she understood business, negotiation, and how to handle drunk men who thought payment was optional. She was also beautiful in that inconvenient way that made nobles nervous. Peasants were supposed to be grimy and bent from labour, not walking around with clear skin and straight teeth like they deserved them. She had red hair that caught sunlight like copper, green eyes that suggested Irish ancestry, and a smile that could serve beer or start wars depending on her mood. Worse, she had opinions about everything, and wasn't shy about sharing them. They met when Edmund's horse threw a shoe. Not romantically, but violently, sending Edmund flying into a puddle that was definitely not just rainwater. Medieval streets were open sewers with delusions of grandeur. His guards wanted to burn something in retaliation, because that's how nobles solved problems. Edmund, covered in substances he didn't want to identify, just wanted to wash. Rose was the one who brought water and cloths, not out of deference, but because her father would murder her if a future earl died of humiliation outside their door. She helped him clean up with the efficiency of someone who'd dealt with worse. Brewery work involved lots of splashing liquids that shouldn't mix, but did. She didn't recognize him, or pretended not to, treating him like any other clumsy customer who'd lost a fight with gravity. She actually critiqued his riding, suggested maybe nobles should spend less time prancing on horses and more time learning to stay on them, offered to teach him how commoners managed to travel without falling into sewage. His guards were horrified. Edmund was enchanted. Nobody had insulted him so cheerfully since his brothers died. He started visiting the brewery daily. His excuse was the ale, which was actually excellent. His guards were confused. Nobles had people to fetch their ale. They didn't drink in common establishments, where anyone could poison them, but Edmund insisted. The beer was worth the journey, worth the smell, worth the risk of mingling with people who had opinions about their betters. Rose served him herself, maintaining the fiction that she didn't know exactly who he was. She critiqued his drinking technique, suggested he was holding the mug wrong, offered remedial lessons in basic ale consumption. She treated him like a particularly slow student who might eventually learn if she was patient enough. It was intoxicating in ways that had nothing to do with alcohol. Their conversations started about brewing. She explained the process like it was alchemy, which it basically was. Water into ale, grain into gold. He'd never thought about where things came from before. Food appeared on his table. Ale appeared in his cup. The idea that someone made these things, that skill and knowledge were involved, was revolutionary. She made him see the world differently. Dangerous thing. Seeing. He started helping. Actual physical labour, which for a nobleman was like a fish climbing trees, lifting barrels, stirring mash, learning that making anything was harder than ordering it made. His soft hands blistered. His back ached. His guards reported back to his father that the heir was performing manual labour like a commoner, by choice. The scandal was magnificent. Rose taught him about real economics. Not the noble version where you owned everything and peasants paid you for the privilege of existing. The actual version where taxes could destroy families, where one bad harvest meant choosing between eating and paying rent, where justice cost more than most people would ever have. She made him see his world from below, and the view was ugly. 6 months into his brewery education, disaster struck. His father arranged a marriage. Lady Margaret of somewhere important, with a dowry that included 3 counties and a personality that included nothing. The wedding would unite 2 great houses and produce heirs who'd continue the noble tradition of owning things and oppressing people. Edmund's opinion wasn't required, neither was his consent. Rose heard the news from a customer. Nobles getting married was entertainment for commoners, like watching bears dance. Painful for the bear, amusing for the audience. She congratulated Edmund on his upcoming nuptials with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Suggested Lady Margaret would appreciate his new barrel lifting skills. Maybe he could carry her over thresholds without dropping her in sewage. That night, Edmund made a decision that would go down in family history as the incident we don't discuss. He publicly refused the marriage. Not quietly, not diplomatically, but in front of the entire court at a feast celebrating the engagement. Stood up between the fish course and the meat course and announced he wouldn't marry Lady Margaret if she was the last woman in England. Which was rude to Lady Margaret, but she probably agreed. His reasoning was simple and catastrophic. He loved someone else, someone who made him laugh, someone who saw him as more than a title with legs, someone who taught him that worth had nothing to do with birth. The court waited for the punchline. Surely he meant another noble lady. A minor scandal, but manageable. Then he said her name. Rose the brewer's daughter. The silence was loud enough to wake the dead. His father aged a decade in a minute. The king, who'd attended because free food, laughed until wine came out his nose. Lady Margaret fainted, though witnesses disagree whether from relief or insult. The court exploded into the kind of whispers that meant this story would be told at every castle from London to Edinburgh. The Earl of Warwick's heir had lost his mind over a peasant, a female peasant, who made beer. The consequences were swift. Edmund was disinherited on the spot, stripped of titles, lands, expectations, and any hope of reconciliation. His father would have killed him, but kinslaying was frowned upon, and there were witnesses. Instead, Edmund was cast out with nothing but the clothes on his back and a skill set completely unsuited to survival. "Go be a peasant," his father said, "if you love them so much." Edmund walked to the brewery. Where else could he go? He arrived at Rose's door as nobody, having been somebody an hour ago. She looked at him, former heir, current nothing, future uncertain, and did what any sensible woman would do. She laughed. Then she asked if he knew how to work for a living, or if she'd have to teach him that too. They married because... why not? He was nobody now. She was nobody with a brewery. In medieval mathematics, that equaled a match. Her father accepted his daughter's choice, because Edmund was strong enough to lift barrels and smart enough to learn. The fact that he'd given up an earldom for Rose probably helped. Hard to doubt someone's commitment when they'd chosen poverty over power for you. The early days were brutal. Nobles make terrible peasants. Edmund had to learn that work started before noon. That meals weren't guaranteed. That being cold, tired, and hungry was normal, not a crisis. His soft hands became calloused. His straight back learned to bend. His noble pride discovered that dignity and manual labour weren't mutually exclusive. Rose was patient, mostly. She only mentioned his former title when he complained too much. But he learned. Love is excellent motivation, and starvation is better. Within a year, he could brew ale that didn't poison people. Within 2, he understood the business well enough to contribute ideas. Within 3, he developed a special brew that became locally famous. He called it Noble's Folly. Customers thought it was clever marketing. They didn't know it was autobiography. They had 6 children who grew up thinking their father had always been a brewer, who learned work and worth weren't related to birth, who married merchants and craftsmen, and never wondered if they deserved better because they'd been raised to know better was about character, not class. The oldest son became a master brewer. The oldest daughter married a scholar. None of them knew their grandfather was an earl. Edmund died at 52, which was ancient for a peasant, but young for what he should have been. Rose lived another decade, running the brewery with children who'd inherited their father's height and their mother's sense. On her deathbed, she told them the truth about their heritage. They didn't believe her. Their father, who'd taught them to judge people by their actions, not their ancestry, had been born to judge people by their ancestry. The irony was too much. But they found proof in his things. Letters in handwriting too educated for a brewer. A signet ring hidden in a box, bearing arms they didn't recognise. Poetry so bad it had to be noble. They burned it all. Their father had chosen to be Edmund the Brewer, not Edmund of Warwick. They'd honour that choice. The brewery lasted centuries. Noble's Folly became a tradition, brewed with the same recipe Edmund developed. Sometimes, late at night when the ale was flowing, someone would tell the story of the earl who fell off his horse and into a better life. Most didn't believe it. Just another tavern tale, improved by telling. But Rose's descendants knew. They kept the secret and the recipe, passing both down through generations. Because sometimes the best inheritance isn't land or gold or titles. Sometimes it's the knowledge that your ancestor chose love over law, happiness over heritage. That when offered everything birth could give, he chose what life could offer. A brewery, a brilliant woman. the freedom to fail or succeed on his own terms. Not all rebellions involve swords. Sometimes they involve choosing to lift barrels instead of swords. Sometimes the greatest nobility is giving up nobility itself. And sometimes, just sometimes, falling off your high horse is the best thing that can happen to you, even if you do land in sewage. Speaking of choosing love over nobility, sometimes the choice was literal. Sometimes a noble looked at their life of privilege and power and said, "You know what? I'd rather make beer with someone who actually likes me. Because in the end, what good is a castle if it feels like a prison?" Enter Edmund of Warwick, fourth son of the Earl of Warwick, who in 1381 was living proof that God has a twisted sense of humour about succession planning. He wasn't supposed to inherit anything. Fourth sons got two career options, the church or an early death in someone else's war. Edmund had chosen option 3, disappointing everyone by surviving while being terrible at both prayer and warfare. But then, medieval mortality rates did their thing. His oldest brother died in a tournament, proving that hitting each other with sticks for entertainment had drawbacks. The second brother caught plague because plague didn't care about your nobility. The third choked on a fishbone during a feast, which was embarrassing for everyone involved, especially the fish. Suddenly, Edmund went from spare part to heir apparent, like winning a lottery nobody wanted to enter. At 20, he was spectacularly unprepared for responsibility. He'd spent his youth doing what fourth sons did, learning just enough Latin to fake prayers, just enough swordplay to not stab himself, and just enough courtly manners to not embarrass the family at dinners. Now he was expected to manage estates, marry strategically, and produce heirs like his life depended on it, which it did. Medieval succession was serious business. The problem was, Edmund had spent his forgotten years developing dangerous habits, like thinking and reading books that weren't just about God or war, and worst of all, talking to common people like they were human beings with interesting opinions. His father blamed the University of Oxford, where Edmund had spent 2 years before dropping out. Education was dangerous. It gave people ideas. Enter Rose, daughter of a brewer, which in medieval terms meant her family was rich, by peasant standards, but still essentially livestock that could count. The brewery sat just outside Warwick Castle, perfectly positioned to supply the endless stream of ale required to make medieval life bearable. Her father had built the business from nothing, which in feudal economics was like performing magic. Peasants weren't supposed to have ambition. It confused the social order. Rose was 19, literate because her mother had been a merchant's daughter who married down for love and spent the rest of her life regretting it every tax season. She could read, write, and do mathematics without using her fingers, which made her more educated than half the nobility. She helped run the brewery, which meant she understood business, negotiation, and how to handle drunk men who thought payment was optional. She was also beautiful in that inconvenient way that made nobles nervous. Peasants were supposed to be grimy and bent from labour, not walking around with clear skin and straight teeth like they deserved them. She had red hair that caught sunlight like copper, green eyes that suggested Irish ancestry, and a smile that could serve beer or start wars depending on her mood. Worse, she had opinions about everything, and wasn't shy about sharing them. They met when Edmund's horse threw a shoe. Not romantically, but violently, sending Edmund flying into a puddle that was definitely not just rainwater. Medieval streets were open sewers with delusions of grandeur. His guards wanted to burn something in retaliation, because that's how nobles solved problems. Edmund, covered in substances he didn't want to identify, just wanted to wash. Rose was the one who brought water and cloths. not out of deference, but because her father would murder her if a future earl died of humiliation outside their door. She helped him clean up with the efficiency of someone who'd dealt with worse. Brewery work involved lots of splashing liquids that shouldn't mix, but did. She didn't recognize him, or pretended not to, treating him like any other clumsy customer who'd lost a fight with gravity. She actually critiqued his riding, suggested maybe nobles should spend less time prancing on horses and more time learning to stay on them, offered to teach him how commoners managed to travel without falling into sewage. His guards were horrified. Edmund was enchanted. Nobody had insulted him so cheerfully since his brothers died. He started visiting the brewery daily. His excuse was the ale, which was actually excellent. His guards were confused. Nobles had people to fetch their ale. They didn't drink in common establishments where anyone could poison them. But Edmund insisted. The beer was worth the journey, worth the smell, worth the risk of mingling with people who had opinions about their betters. Rose served him herself, maintaining the fiction that she didn't know exactly who he was. She critiqued his drinking technique, suggested he was holding the mug wrong, offered remedial lessons in basic ale consumption. She treated him like a particularly slow student who might eventually learn if she was patient enough. It was intoxicating in ways that had nothing to do with alcohol. Their conversations started about brewing. She explained the process like it was alchemy, which it basically was. Water into ale, grain into gold. He'd never thought about where things came from before. Food appeared on his table. Ale appeared in his cup. The idea that someone made these things, that skill and knowledge were involved, was revolutionary. She made him see the world differently. Dangerous thing. Seeing. He started helping. Actual physical labour, which for a nobleman was like a fish climbing trees, lifting barrels, stirring mash, learning that making anything was harder than ordering it made. His soft hands blistered. His back ached. His guards reported back to his father that the heir was performing manual labour like a commoner by choice. The scandal was magnificent. Rose taught him about real economics, not the noble version where you owned everything and peasants paid you for the privilege of existing. The actual version where taxes could destroy families, where one bad harvest meant choosing between eating and paying rent, where justice cost more than most people would ever have. She made him see his world from below, and the view was ugly. 6 months into his brewery education, disaster struck. His father arranged a marriage, Lady Margaret of somewhere important, with a dowry that included 3 counties and a personality that included nothing. The wedding would unite 2 great houses and produce heirs who'd continue the noble tradition of owning things and oppressing people. Edmund's opinion wasn't required. Neither was his consent. Rose heard the news from a customer. Nobles getting married was entertainment for commoners, like watching bears dance. Painful for the bear, amusing for the audience. She congratulated Edmund on his upcoming nuptials with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Suggested Lady Margaret would appreciate his new barrel-lifting skills. Maybe he could carry her over thresholds without dropping her in sewage. That night, Edmund made a decision that would go down in family history as the incident we don't discuss. He publicly refused the marriage, not quietly, not diplomatically, but in front of the entire court at a feast celebrating the engagement. Stood up between the fish course and the meat course and announced he wouldn't marry Lady Margaret if she was the last woman in England. Which was rude to Lady Margaret, but she probably agreed. His reasoning was simple and catastrophic. He loved someone else. Someone who made him laugh. Someone who saw him as more than a title with legs. Someone who taught him that worth had nothing to do with birth. The court waited for the punchline. Surely he meant another noble lady. A minor scandal, but manageable. Then he said her name. Rose the brewer's daughter. The silence was loud enough to wake the dead. His father aged a decade in a minute. The king, who'd attended because free food, laughed until wine came out his nose. Lady Margaret fainted, though witnesses disagree whether from relief or insult. The court exploded into the kind of whispers that meant this story would be told at every castle from London to Edinburgh. The Earl of Warwick's heir had lost his mind over a peasant, a female peasant, who made beer. The consequences were swift. Edmund was disinherited on the spot, stripped of titles, lands, expectations, and any hope of reconciliation. His father would have killed him, but kinslaying was frowned upon, and there were witnesses. Instead, Edmund was cast out with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a skill set completely unsuited to survival. "Go be a peasant," his father said, "if you love them so much." Edmund walked to the brewery. Where else could he go? He arrived at Rose's door as nobody, having been somebody an hour ago. She looked at him, former heir, current nothing, future uncertain, and did what any sensible woman would do. She laughed. Then she asked if he knew how to work for a living, or if she'd have to teach him that too. They married because... why not? He was nobody now. She was nobody with a brewery. In medieval mathematics, that equaled a match. Her father accepted his daughter's choice, because Edmund was strong enough to lift barrels and smart enough to learn. The fact that he'd given up an earldom for Rose probably helped. Hard to doubt someone's commitment when they'd chosen poverty over power for you. The early days were brutal. Nobles make terrible peasants. Edmund had to learn that work started before noon, that meals weren't guaranteed, that being cold, tired, and hungry was normal, not a crisis. His soft hands became calloused, his straight back learned to bend. His noble pride discovered that dignity and manual labour weren't mutually exclusive. Rose was patient, mostly. She only mentioned his former title when he complained too much. But he learned. Love is excellent motivation, and starvation is better. Within a year, he could brew ale that didn't poison people. Within 2, he understood the business well enough to contribute ideas. Within 3, he developed a special brew that became locally famous. He called it Noble's Folly. Customers thought it was clever marketing. They didn't know it was autobiography. They had 6 children who grew up thinking their father had always been a brewer, who learned work and worth weren't related to birth, who married merchants and craftsmen and never wondered if they deserved better because they'd been raised to know better was about character, not class. The oldest son became a master brewer. The oldest daughter married a scholar. None of them knew their grandfather was an earl. Edmund died at 52, which was ancient for a peasant, but young for what he should have been. Rose lived another decade, running the brewery with children who'd inherited their father's height and their mother's sense. On her deathbed, she told them the truth about their heritage. They didn't believe her. Their father, who'd taught them to judge people by their actions, not their ancestry, had been born to judge people by their ancestry. The irony was too much. But they found proof in his things. Letters in handwriting too educated for a brewer. A signet ring hidden in a box, bearing arms they didn't recognize. Poetry so bad it had to be noble. They burned it all. Their father had chosen to be Edmund the brewer, not Edmund of Warwick. They'd honour that choice. The brewery lasted centuries. Noble's Folly became a tradition, brewed with the same recipe Edmund developed. Sometimes, Late at night, when the ale was flowing, someone would tell the story of the earl who fell off his horse and into a better life. Most didn't believe it. Just another tavern tale, improved by telling. But Rose's descendants knew. They kept the secret and the recipe, passing both down through generations. Because sometimes the best inheritance isn't land or gold or titles. Sometimes it's the knowledge that your ancestor chose love over law, happiness over heritage. That when offered everything birth could give, he chose what life could offer: a brewery, a brilliant woman, the freedom to fail or succeed on his own terms. Not all rebellions involve swords. Sometimes they involve choosing to lift barrels instead of swords. Sometimes the greatest nobility is giving up nobility itself. And sometimes, just sometimes, falling off your high horse is the best thing that can happen to you, even if you do land in sewage. And then there's the forbidden love story that broke all the rules by actually working out. Not perfectly, not without casualties, but in a way that proves sometimes the universe has a sense of humour about human suffering. The story of Joanna of Navarre and Geoffrey the scribe, which ended not in death or separation, but in something far more scandalous, quiet happiness. 1400, France, where the nobility were busy murdering each other over who got to wear the fanciest hat and call themselves king. Joanna wasn't French nobility. She was Navarre's nobility, which was like being French nobility, but with better weather and more complicated politics. At 30, she was married to Duke John of Brittany, a man who loved three things: war, wine, and definitely not his wife. Duke John was the kind of husband medieval women dreamed about in their nightmares. He treated marriage like a business merger, where Joanna was a silent partner who wasn't supposed to be that silent. She'd given him 9 children in 12 years, which was basically a full-time job with terrible working conditions. He'd given her a castle to run and the freedom to do whatever she wanted, as long as what she wanted was embroidery and producing more heirs. Joanna was brilliant, which in a medieval duchess was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. She could speak 6 languages fluently, which just meant she could be ignored in multiple tongues. She understood economics better than her husband's treasurers, who were mostly employed based on their ability to steal creatively. She had ideas about governance that might have worked if anyone cared what women thought about anything beyond baby production. The Duke spent most of his time away, fighting whoever was available to fight. The English, the French, other Bretons who looked at him wrong. He'd leave for months, sometimes years, returning just long enough to impregnate Joanna and criticise how she'd run things in his absence. It was the medieval equivalent of a long-distance relationship, except the distance was intentional and the relationship was fictional. Enter Geoffrey the scribe. Not noble, not common, but existing in that weird medieval middle ground of people who could read and therefore couldn't be completely discounted. He was 28, unmarried because scribes made terrible husband material, all that education and no land. What was the point? He worked for the Duke, copying documents, writing letters, and slowly dying inside from recording the fascinating details of sheep taxation. Geoffrey had the kind of mind that should have been at university, debating whether angels could dance on pinheads. Instead, he was using it to spell creative variations of ode and O's to make tax records less monotonous. He spoke Latin like a Roman, French like a courtier, and Breton like someone who'd given up on life. He had hands that should have been painting illuminated manuscripts, but were instead cramping from writing 2 chickens and a goat for the 1000th time. They met because Joanna decided to audit the duchy's finances. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she was bored, and numbers were more interesting than needlework. The treasury was a mess. Not surprising, since the treasurer's main qualification was being the Duke's drinking companion. She needed someone who could actually read the records, understand the mathematics, and wouldn't report back to her husband that his wife was doing something useful. Geoffrey was assigned to help her because he was competent and expendable. If the Duchess wanted to waste time pretending to understand finances, let the scribe humour her. What harm could it do? He arrived at their first meeting prepared to explain basic addition to a woman who probably thought numbers were decorative. She opened by correcting an error in his calculations. Not a small error. A significant, empire-affecting error that suggested someone had been stealing creatively for years. Their meetings became regular. Daily audits that revealed the duchy was being robbed blind by everyone from the treasurer to the stable boys. Joanna had a gift for seeing patterns in numbers, for understanding the story they told. Geoffrey had a gift for explaining complex ideas without condescension, for treating her intelligence as a given rather than a surprise. Together, they uncovered fraud that would have impressed modern accountants. But the real discovery was each other. She'd never met a man who listened when she talked. He'd never met a woman who had anything to say. Not because women were inherently boring, but because noble women were trained from birth to be decorative rather than functional. Joanna had somehow survived that training with her mind intact. Geoffrey found it intoxicating. Intelligence is attractive in any century. Their relationship evolved from professional to personal, so gradually neither noticed until they were already lost. Financial discussions became philosophical debates. Reviews of tax records became conversations about Aristotle, Plato, and whether the Holy Roman Empire was holy, Roman, or an empire. She taught him about statecraft from a ruler's perspective. He taught her about life from someone who actually lived it. They were careful, but not careful enough. Medieval privacy was a myth, especially for duchesses. Someone noticed she smiled during their meetings. Someone else noticed he stayed later than necessary. By the time someone noticed they were discussing Ovid's poetry in Latin, while definitely not looking at tax records, the entire castle knew. A duchess and a scribe. The scandal was delicious. Duke John was away, of course, fighting someone somewhere about something that seemed important if you squinted. But gossip travels faster than armies, and eventually word reached him that his wife was spending suspicious amounts of time with a man who wasn't him. Not that he spent time with her himself, but the principle was important. She was his property. Property wasn't supposed to have preferences. His response was measured and medieval. He sent word that Geoffrey was to be transferred to Gascony immediately, to copy records about wine production that definitely needed copying right now and couldn't wait. It was exile dressed as promotion. Take it or die. Not a difficult choice, except it was. Because leaving meant leaving Joanna, and staying meant definitely dying, but at least dying near her. Joanna's response was elegant. She announced she needed to tour the duchy's holdings, all of them, including the ones in Gascony, for tax purposes. Very important tax purposes that required her personal attention and definitely her financial advisor. Duke John could hardly object. She was doing Duchess things. The fact that Duchess things now included following her scribe across France was a detail. The tour lasted 2 years. 2 years of visiting every minor holding, reviewing every account, and coincidentally spending hours in private financial conferences with Geoffrey. They were scrupulously professional in public. In private, They built something that couldn't be named without destroying it. Not an affair. Affairs were physical, temporary, tawdry. This was a meeting of minds that happened to come with bodies attached. They wrote poetry together. Bad poetry, because intelligence doesn't automatically translate to artistic talent. They created a cipher for their correspondence, part Latin, part mathematics, part inside jokes that no decoder would ever crack. They discussed everything from theology to sheep husbandry. They fell in love incrementally, intellectually, inevitably. Duke John died in 1499, gloriously in battle, which was the only way he knew how to do anything. Joanna mourned appropriately, which meant wearing black and trying not to smile when she realised she was free. Free to rule Brittany as regent for her son. Free to make her own choices. Free to appoint whatever advisors she deemed necessary. Like, for instance, a particularly talented scribe who understood both finances and Latin poetry. But freedom for medieval women was always conditional. Her children needed alliances. Brittany needed protection. She needed to remarry, and kings were interested. Henry IV of England was shopping for a wife. He was paranoid, possibly insane, definitely dangerous. He was also powerful enough to protect Brittany, and desperate enough not to ask too many questions about her household arrangements. The night before she left for England, she met Geoffrey in the library, where they'd spent years pretending to review accounts. He asked her to stay. She asked him to come. Both knew neither was possible. A Duchess regent could have a discreet advisor. A Queen of England couldn't have anything that might scandal. They had one night to say goodbye to 10 years of careful love. But here's where the story diverges from tragedy. Because Joanna wasn't just brilliant, she was practical. She couldn't take Geoffrey to England, but she could leave him with something better than memories. She established a school for scribes and accountants in Nantes, funded by her personal income, protected by ducal charter, run by the most qualified administrator she knew. Geoffrey became master of the school, teaching Latin, mathematics, accounting, and the radical idea that education should be based on merit, not birth. The school accepted students from everywhere. Noble sons who needed practical skills. Merchant daughters who had the minds for numbers. Even peasant children who showed promise. It was revolutionary. It was scandalous. It was protected by royal patronage. They wrote constantly. Letters that looked like educational correspondence but read like love poems if you knew the cipher. Mathematical equations that somehow always equaled 2. Latin verses about grammar that were definitely about grammar and not about the way candlelight used to catch in her hair. 20 years of correspondence disguised as academic exchange. She established more schools. In Brittany, in England, wherever she had influence. All run by Geoffrey's students, all teaching his methods. A network of education that spread across 2 kingdoms, changing how people thought about learning, merit, and the radical idea that minds mattered more than blood. Every school was a love letter. Every student was a promise kept. Their son was raised as Geoffrey's apprentice, brilliant, educated, and completely unaware he was half royal. Geoffrey never told him. Some secrets are too dangerous, even for family. But he taught him everything else. Languages, mathematics, philosophy, and, most importantly, the belief that knowledge was power and power should be shared. The boy became a scholar, taught at Paris, wrote treatises that changed how Europe thought about education. Joanna died in 1437, 67 years old, ancient for anyone in medieval times. Geoffrey lived another 5 years, teaching until the end. When they cleared his rooms, they found her letters, thousands of pages of correspondence that looked educational but read like the greatest romance never told. The church wanted them burned. The university wanted them preserved. They compromised. The letters were archived as pedagogical materials, advanced curriculum development. But they kept the cipher key, Geoffrey's students, Joanna's legacy. They passed it down through generations of teachers who understood that some lessons can't be written in plain text. That love takes many forms. That sometimes the greatest rebellion is building something that lasts longer than kingdoms. Today, historians study their correspondence and miss the point entirely. They see education reform and fiscal policy. They miss the love story hidden in plain sight. Because that's what made their love successful. Not passion that burned bright and brief. Not tragedy that made good songs. But patience that built institutions. Love that expressed itself in schools and students, and the slow transformation of two kingdoms' approach to merit. They couldn't be together, so they changed the world together instead. Apart, but aligned. Separated, but never severed. Every student who learned to read because of their schools was a child they couldn't have. Every girl who studied mathematics was a daughter they couldn't raise. Every peasant boy who became a scholar was proof that love doesn't always look like poetry. Sometimes it looks like lesson plans. Sometimes the greatest romance is written in curriculum. They never saw each other again after that night in Nantes. But for 30 years, they built something better than a life together. They built a world where people like them could exist, where scribes could matter, where duchesses could think, where love could take forms that didn't fit in songs, but lasted longer than stones. Not all love stories end with death or marriage. Some end with universities and changed minds and the quiet revolution of making the impossible gradually normal. Some end not with star-crossed lovers in graves, but with ideas that refuse to die. Some end with 1,000 students who never knew their teachers were in love, but learned about love anyway, through Greek verbs and mathematical proofs. And maybe that's the best ending of all. Not Romeo and Juliet, dramatic and brief. Not Tristan and Isolde, passionate and doomed. But Geoffrey and Joanna, who loved so quietly and so well that their love became invisible, became infrastructure, became the thing that let other loves flourish. In the archives of the Sorbonne, their letters still wait, labelled wrong, catalogued as educational materials, gathering dust like sacred relics that everyone's forgotten are sacred. But if you know the cipher, if you can read between the Latin lines, you'll find it. The greatest love story medieval Europe never knew it had, the one that worked. And that's the thing about forbidden love in medieval times. We remember the tragedies, the disasters, the loves that burned bright and died young. We forget the ones that survived by transforming, by becoming something else, by building rather than burning. We forget that sometimes the best rebellion isn't dying for love. Sometimes it's living for it, quietly, carefully, successfully. Looking back at all these stories, the nuns who chose knights over Christ, the crusaders who discovered the enemy had hearts, the monks who broke vows that were breaking them, the nobles who chose love over land, what strikes you isn't their tragedy, it's their humanity. In a world designed to keep people apart, sorted by class and faith and law, they found each other. Against odds that would make modern dating apps look easy, they risked everything. Benedetta her vows, Geoffrey his freedom, Abelard his manhood, quite literally. Sarah her faith, Edmund his inheritance. Each chose love over safety, passion over propriety, connection over convention. Some paid with their lives, some with their freedom, some with body parts, they probably needed. But they all chose. And that's what forbidden love in medieval times really teaches us. Not that love conquers all, it clearly doesn't. Not that passion is worth any price. Ask Abelard about that. But that throughout history, in every age, under every oppressive system, people have chosen connection over safety, have decided that a moment of real love is worth a lifetime of fake propriety. In castles and convents, in Jewish quarters and Muslim palaces, in breweries and scriptoriums, medieval people proved that love is the ultimate rebellion, not because it's dramatic or poetic or makes good songs, but because it insists on seeing people as people, on choosing who you love instead of who you're told to love, on building something together even if society says you can't. We remember the Middle Ages for plagues and crusades, and the general misery of existing before antibiotics. But maybe we should remember it for this too. For all the people who looked at a system designed to crush human connection and said no, who chose love over law, hearts over hierarchy, each other over everything. Because in the end, that's what makes us human. Not our ability to follow rules or honour traditions or stay in our assigned boxes, but our absolute inability to stop falling in love with the wrong people at the worst times for the most beautiful reasons. Medieval times tried to forbid love. Love won anyway. It always does. Just not always the way you'd expect. Sometimes with castration. But still,